Okay, thanks everyone. If you could take your seats, we'll get started. So we have 3 talks this afternoon. First one by Yen-ting, who's going to tell us about assembly bias.
Okay. So thank you, Joe. Good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share with you our recent results on detecting halo assembly bias assisted by a constrained simulation of the local universe. My collaborators are listed here. I would especially like to thank Hirono, who is over there, for his great contribution in providing weak lensing measurements. And if time allows, I would also like to flash a few slides on a model that we are working on, which is a graph neural network model that can predict galactic baryonic properties of galaxies purely from n-body simulations, more specifically the dark matter halo merger trees from redshift 0 to 5. So let's start with assembly bias. We know that dark matter halos are biased tracers of underlying matter field in the sense that more massive halos are more biased. This plot shows the bias as a function of halo mass. With the advent of high resolution n-body simulations, we are able to discover a phenomenon called assembly bias, which refers to the fact that halo bias not only depends on halo mass, but also on other halo properties, such as formation time, concentration, or spin, etc. As an illustration, on the left and middle panel, and showing the spatial distribution of 20% youngest and 20% oldest low mass halos with mass around 10 to 11 to 10 to 12 solar masses from Millennium simulation. You can clearly see that their clustering patterns are very different, with old halos having 40% larger bias compared to the younger ones. In this figure by Jing et al., we see that for cluster scale halos above 10 to 14 solar masses, the youngest halos, shown as the blue points, actually have 10% higher bias compared to the oldest halos, shown as the red points. And it is apparent that the difference in the bias is largest at low mass halo regime, like 10 to 11 to 10 to 12 solar masses. And as assembly bias is a robust prediction or feature of lambda CDM, it is important to find observational evidence for that. And therefore, in 2016, I tried to detect assembly bias observationally for Milky Way-like halos by constructing a pair of early and late forming halos selected by the star formation history of the central galaxy, under the assumption that the star formation history of the central galaxies correlates well with the formation history of the halos. Our measurements are shown here. The top panel shows the projected correlation function. The early and late forming samples are shown in red and blue, respectively. The early to late bias ratio squared is shown in the middle panel as the green points. The bottom panel shows the lensing signals, which indicate that the 2 samples have comparable masses, about 9 times 10 to 11 solar masses. The shaded region in this middle panel shows the theoretical expectation. The probability for that to be consistent with our measurements is at the level of 5 times 10 to the minus 5. So we didn't find convincing evidence of assembly bias. This may be due to the fact that the age indicator we use, I couldn't
It's okay. You can turn it down.
Okay, which is based on the code VESPA, which use the Sloan spectra, is not of sufficient good quality. In the business of detecting assembly bias, the most important ingredient is to have a reliable proxy of halo formation time that works on individual halo basis. This would become possible if we have a complete description of the local universe. It will be like a dream come true if we know the mass accretion history of every halo. And in fact, using the group catalog of Yang et al., Wang et al. Have run a constraint simulation called eLucid. I will not go into details of how they did it, but simply put, based on the group and cluster catalog from Yang, they were able to reconstruct the density field of the local Sloan volume out to redshift 0.12. And then with a clever way of rapidly exploring the initial conditions, they have found one configuration that by redshift 0 that looks just like the Sloan volume. So for structures larger than 2 megaparsecs, there's a very good correspondence between the Sloan large-scale structures and elucid structures. So we therefore take the advantage of this high fidelity simulation of the local universe for the study of assembly bias at high mass regime. Basically, we took the most massive 630 clusters from Yang's catalog. And then for each of the cluster, we find its counterpart in elucid. And then we use the formation time information of the halo as the formation time for the real cluster. This way, for all these clusters, we know which ones are early forming, which ones are late forming. So we first split the cluster sample in half by Z50, which is the time when the halo reaches 50% of its final mass. With a dividing redshift of 0.521, we have 323 old and 311 young clusters. The lensing measurements are shown here, which is based on the Sloan shear catalog. The masses of the early and late forming samples shown as the red and blue points are basically the same, 1.5 times 10 to the 14 solar masses. Our clustering measurements, which is based on cross correlation, which is a projected cross correlation function, was carried out using cluster galaxy cross correlation with the Sloan main galaxy sample. And the relative bias of the two samples is shown here. With assembly bias, we expect the ratio to be less than unity. And indeed, you see that our points are somewhat lower than unity. The probability for the two samples to have the same bias is about 2.6%. However, Xue et al. Have argued that for halos around 10 to 14 solar masses, which is the mass scale of our clusters, Z50 turns out not to be the optimal choice to split early forming halos from late forming ones. So we should consider other formation time definition or use the extrema of the distribution. So to see if we can detect the signal even more strongly, we use an age indicator Z20 and consider the extrema in Z20 and only use the clusters in a limited range in mass and redshift. So with 138 oldest and 121 youngest clusters with log mass between 14 and 14.5, which is based on the mass estimates from Yang's catalog, and redshift between 0.06 and 0.12, we found that the two samples, early and late forming samples, have masses consistent within 1 sigma. please note that the early forming sample has slightly larger mass than the late forming one. And now you can see their clustering is very different. The early to late bias ratio is far from unity and with the correct sign too. The youngest halos are more strongly clustered or having higher bias compared to the older ones. The two samples, the probability for the two samples to have the same bias is 10 to the minus 10. And open triangles here show the theoretical expectation extracted from n-body simulations, which we directly took from Euclid. So with 98 early and 82 late forming halos with a mean mass of 1.3 times 10 to the 14 solar masses, we see that they are in good agreement with our measurements, the green solid points. So in other words, we believe we have a strong detection. As you can see, our lensing measurements are somewhat noisy. So these are the lensing masses. So although even though we can constrain the masses of the two samples, we cannot really constrain the concentration. So it is important to ask whether our weak lensing masses were off. We consider two potential cases. In the first one, maybe the early forming sample mass is biased high by 1 sigma, while that of the late forming sample is biased low by 1 sigma, which has a 2.6% chance to occur. In the second case, maybe the late forming sample mass is biased low by at least 2 sigma, which has a 2.3% to happen. So for the first case, after lowering the mass of the early forming sample by 1 sigma and increasing the mass of the late forming sample by 1 sigma, we found that the probability for their bias ratio to be consistent with the measured one is 7.5 times 10 to the minus 5. As for the second case, after increasing the mass of the late forming sample by 2 sigma, the probability is still at 2.4 times 10 to the minus 5 level. I should note that for all these calculations, we have assumed the Tinker et al. 2008 bias mass relation. So if we assume a 10% uncertainty at the high mass end and lower the expected biases by that amount, then the probabilities become 0.0053 and 0.00225, both about 3 sigma events. Next, we explore the properties of the cluster galaxy populations of the two samples. Using a cluster galaxy cross-correlation method, we derive the surface density profile of the member galaxies. So in this figure, the red and blue points are for red and blue galaxies. The black points are for the whole galaxy population. The early forming and late forming samples are shown on the left and right, respectively. It is found that the galaxies are more concentrated in the early forming sample. Fitting an NFW profile to the red galaxies, we found the concentration to be 7.1 and 5.6 for the early and late forming samples, respectively, which is consistent with the expectation that for an old cluster population, both the mass and galaxy distribution should be more concentrated. We further found that the number of galaxies in our early forming sample is 25% lower than that in the late forming sample. And given that the early forming sample is slightly more massive than that of the late forming sample, and the fact that the cluster galaxy number goes as mass to a 0.8 power. This makes the deficit of galaxy number in our early forming sample to be 60% fewer than the late forming sample if assembly bias doesn't play a role. Such a reduction could be due to that for an old cluster population, there's more time for dynamical processes to work and sink the galaxies to the bottom of the potential well and merge with the BCG. We didn't find appreciable differences in the mean age of the BCG or other cluster member galaxies using both full spectral fitting method as well as SCD fitting method. But we did see hints of differences in the magnitude gap between BCG and G2, which is the second most luminous galaxy. The magnitude gap for the early forming sample is 0.44, while that for the late forming one is 0.38. We also measure the median offset of BCG from the cluster center, which is defined to be the stellar mass weighted mean position of member galaxies. So for early forming sample, the offset is 11% of R200, and that for the late forming sample is 14% of R200. All of these are consistent with the notion that the early forming sample is indeed older, allowing BCGs to settle to the center and accrete more mass by galactic cannibalism. And as a sanity check, we have constructed 14 pairs of control samples, which have the similar distributions in halo mass and redshift as our real cluster samples. So in each of these 14 panels, the three numbers denote the masses of the early and late analog clusters and the probability for their bias ratio to be consistent with the theoretical expectation, which is shown as the red horizontal line. You will see that none of this shows signals as strong as our real cluster samples. And for these 14 pairs of control samples, their mean BCG offset as well as the magnitude gap are basically the same, unlike in the real cluster sample. So I think a burning question that some of you may have now is, are we measuring assembly bias in the real universe, or are we measuring it in eLOCIT? So we try to analyze this in a Bayesian way. In simplest terms, we can recast our study as a hypothesis test with the ultimate goal of ruling out the null hypothesis that there is no assembly bias in the universe. And write the equation PAB given data eLOCIT is proportional to P data given AB eLOCIT times PAB given eLOCIT, where AB stands for assembly bias exists in the universe, and data represents the properties of our cluster samples, including the weak lensing masses, clustering measurements, and the properties of the cluster galaxies. For the prior, we take it to be uninformative, so just 0 or 1, each with equal probability. As for the likelihood, we consider 4 cases that result from the combination of 1, whether AB exists in the universe, and 2, whether AB exists in eLOCIT, and compare our observations with the expected observational signals to deduce in which one of these boxes are we located in. So in this table, the first entries indicate that assembly bias exists in eLOCIT, and the second entries indicate that assembly bias exists in the real universe. Since we did see assembly bias in eLOCIT, as shown by the open triangles, we can rule out 2 of the 4 cases. So the main issue now is to see whether our data also requires assembly bias to be present in the real universe. To do so, let's look at this table. So in the first column, I show the 4 observable that I mentioned before. And in the second and third column, I show the expected and observed trends for the early and late forming samples. Encouragingly, they agree with each other. And then in the fourth column, I show the case where we are really just measuring assembly bias in eLucid. And there is no assembly bias in the real universe. By circularity, I mean that since the density field that eLucid is tasked to reconstruct is based on the group and cluster catalog of Yang et al., it is natural to expect the eLucid halos to be located in similar large-scale environments as our real clusters. But in this case, the formation time Z20 should only be meaningful for the eLucid halos and have nothing to do with the real clusters. And given that the early and late forming samples have similar masses, we therefore expect the galaxy properties to be similar for these cases. And finally, this last column shows the case when our late forming sample mass is significantly underestimated. Given the concentration varies only very weakly with cluster mass, we therefore expect the concentration of galaxies to be similar in early and late forming samples. And as I mentioned, n goes as n to 0.8 power, albeit with very large scatter. We expect the number of galaxies in early forming samples to be somewhat smaller than that in the late forming ones. And based on the 28 control samples that we have, we see a clear trend of BCG offset decreasing with increasing cluster mass. So we have DE greater than DL. And various studies, including one of my own, have shown that the magnitude gap decreases with increasing cluster mass. So we have delta E greater than delta L. And I should note that none of the 14 pairs of control samples passes these observational tests. And so the logical conclusion would be we live in this yes and yes box. And let me note that even if the mean mass of our late forming sample is really severely underestimated, the difference in the mass is still far from sufficient to explain the huge difference in biases that we see. And that hints on something like assembly bias at work. So I hope that I have convinced you that we have detected assembly bias at the high mass end, and that will be that's an important validation of nano-CDM. We can use eLucid to study other aspects of assembly bias, like spin or concentration. But it will be difficult to detect splashback radius due to the small sample size we have. And in any case, it is critical to find ways that are more directly linked to real observations to label clusters as early or late forming. So we hope to construct such cluster samples using the observable trends we found here, like member galaxy concentration, galaxy number, etc. And rich data sets from DESI and in the future PFS will allow such a reconstruction to be done at higher redshift and enable studies of assembly bias or galactic conformity at earlier cosmic times. So if I may take just a few more minutes, let me show this GNN-based model very quickly. So this is purely a curiosity-driven project. We simply want to know if it's possible to infer the baryonic properties of galaxies purely from the dark matter halo merger trees these galaxies live in. And it turns out it works. We can infer the galaxy properties along the, well, anywhere along the merger tree, such as the stellar mass, star formation rate, color, etc., from redshift 5 to 0. Let me skip the architecture and just show you the comparison between our predicted and the true values for stellar mass, star formation rate, and G-R color. So you see that our predictions are unbiased in 4 redshift bins from 0 to 2. And in this panel, I show the stellar mass assembly history of 2 sets of galaxy samples. The blue is for galaxies with present-day mass, log mass of between 10.6 and 11.7. And the red is for lower mass galaxies between 10 and 10.6 from redshift 5 to 0. And these 2 panels show a zoom in from redshift 2 to 0. So our prediction for stellar mass is accurate with a scatter of 0.13 DAX. And color also, which is as good as can be done. As GNN is a black box, we hope to learn galaxy formation from it by removing the many features we included in the model systematically and see which ones affect the performance most of the model. And that should be the most critical for galaxy formation. And it turns out that halo mass and subhalo mass play the most critical roles, which probably is not surprising. So just to summarize, I hope that I have convinced you that constraint simulations are useful, at least can be used for detecting or characterization of assembly bias. And this GNN-based model hopefully can find many other applications. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Yen-ting. Nice talk. Are there questions? Yes.
That was great. When we had a small sample size and we were looking for an assembly bias effect, and Beppy Torman and I did a Mark correlation function analysis. So instead of splitting the sample into 20% and 20%, you just weight each object by its formation time. That way you get to use the full sample.
Right.
And it would be interesting to see.
Yes, that's a clever idea. We should do that.
Sorry, an unrelated question, but since it's a talk on eLucid and there was a talk on bulk flows in the morning, has your group looked at bulk flows in eLucid around Milky Way sized halos?
Right. So as I said, even though eLucid is a very high resolution simulation, well, I didn't say that, but it is a very high resolution simulation. The way they constructed the density field is after some smoothing. So that's why I think you can only trust the structures in eLucid that's larger than 2 megaparsecs. So I'm not sure if this can be applied to like individual galaxy level. So studying bulk flow may, in my opinion, may not be feasible.
May I ask just a quick question? You ended by saying that it'd be nice to have observables that can help us understand which clusters formed late, which clusters formed early. Do you have concerns about cluster power spectra, or are there cosmological concerns in the absence of that knowledge? I mean, is that going to help us do better?
I haven't thought about whether assembly bias can be used for constraining cosmology. And it's indeed interesting to see if the assembly bias signal varies with cosmology. But I think right now the zeros order issue is if we can construct early and late forming samples without the aid of this kind of simulation, that will make Surhud very happy, and me too. So even with good mass proxies like X-ray, I think it still has substantial scatter to detect subtle things like assembly bias.
But if I can push a little harder on Joe's question, is it possible that red mapper, by selecting particular colors, will end up giving you biased constraints?
Well, the thing with red mapper, it's difficult to avoid the projection effects. The correlated large-scale structure along the line of sight, which is not the problem with the Young's catalog here, because it's basically a match filter based on spectroscopically confirmed galaxies. So if from DESI, we can construct a similarly, a much larger sample, then perhaps it's possible. And with your marked correlation function.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we should move on. Let's thank Yen-ting again.